The official letter arrived on embossed legal stationery, coldly informing me that my name had been removed from all property deeds by Mr. Harrison Reed. I remember tracing my fingers over the raised seal of the law firm as I read the document, a strange calmness washing over me. The irony wasn't lost on me that Harrison had chosen Valentine's Day to formally announce his betrayal, the same day I'd received confirmation that my separate holding company had successfully completed the purchase of our entire real estate portfolio 3 weeks earlier. While he believed he was claiming everything, I had already secured what was rightfully mine through a series of strategic moves he'd been too self-absorbed to notice. Sometimes the most powerful position is the "when your opponent doesn't know you" hold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The sprawling Tudor home on Lakeview Drive represented everything Harrison and I had built together over 15 years of marriage. Or at least, that's what Harrison believed. As I stood in the spacious kitchen that Sunday morning, watching the autumn rain trace patterns down the leaded glass windows, I felt that familiar weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders. The weight I'd carried silently for so long, while Harrison pursued his ambitions. "Rebecca, did you see my presentation notes? The Carlton Group meeting is tomorrow, and I need to review everything before dinner with the investors tonight." Harrison's voice echoed from his home office, that familiar note of barely contained stress evident even through the closed door. "Check your leather portfolio, the one on your desk," I called back, knowing exactly where they were because I'd organized them myself after he'd scattered them across the dining room table last night. The Carlton Group represented Harrison's latest and potentially greatest business opportunity, a commercial real estate development that could transform the abandoned Riverside district into a modern mixed-use complex. The project that would finally establish Harrison Reed as a major player in development circles after years of moderate successes and near misses. What Harrison didn't know, what I had carefully ensured he didn't know, was that the financial foundation enabling his ambitious venture had been quietly secured and protected by me over the past 7 years. Our story wasn't particularly unique in its beginning. We met at Northwestern, both ambitious students with big dreams. Harrison, with his magnetic charm and bold vision for revolutionizing urban spaces. Me, with my analytical mind and talent for seeing financial patterns others missed. We complemented each other perfectly, or so I thought. He was the visionary. I was the pragmatist who made his visions possible. After graduation, Harrison launched his first development company while I took a position at Meridian Financial, quickly advancing through the ranks. My salary provided our financial stability during those early years when Harrison's projects generated more excitement than profit. I handled our household finances, managed our investments, and quietly built the infrastructure that supported his increasingly ambitious ventures. Found them. Harrison appeared in the kitchen doorway, presentation folder in hand, his still handsome face revealing the strain of recent weeks. At 43, Harrison Reed remained as charismatic as when we'd met, though the confident smile now came with slight creases around his eyes and distinguished touches of gray at his temples. "You're a lifesaver, Beck." I offered a small smile in return. "The Carlton presentation looks strong. I reviewed it last night after you went to bed." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "You did? Any suggestions?" There was that familiar note in his voice, a mixture of genuine interest in my opinion and subtle defensiveness at the possibility of criticism. "Just a few thoughts on the financing structure. The debt-to-equity ratio might raise questions. From conservative investors. I made some notes on page 17. He flipped to the page, scanning my neat handwriting in the margins. "Always looking out for me," he said, his tone softening. "This is good, really good." He closed the folder and approached, placing a quick kiss on my cheek. What would I do without my financial wizard? The question hung in the air, more relevant than Harrison realized. What would he do without me? It was a question I'd been contemplating with increasing frequency over the past year as subtle signs accumulated, pointing toward a conclusion I'd been reluctant to accept. Signs like the mysterious weekend conferences that appeared on his calendar with vague descriptions. The new cologne I'd never purchased for him, the increasingly frequent late nights and distracted responses to my questions. And most telling, his sudden interest in our property holdings and investment structures after years of leaving those details entirely to me. Harrison checked his watch. I need to meet with Trevor before the investor dinner. Don't wait up tonight. These, things always run late. Another kiss, this one even more perfunctory, and he was gone, leaving behind only the fading scent of that unfamiliar cologne. I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway before moving to my home office, the smallest room in our house but the one space that was entirely mine. Unlocking my personal laptop, I reviewed the email that had arrived yesterday from my attorney, Sophia Lynn. Final documents prepared for Oakmont Holdings, LLC. Awaiting your signature to complete transfer of all property assets. Timeline as discussed. Oakmont Holdings, the limited liability company I'd established 18 months ago, structured with careful precision under Sophia's expert guidance. The vehicle through which I had gradually secured our property holdings, the lakefront home, the downtown apartment, the vacation cabin, and the small commercial building that housed Harrison's first successful project. My decision to create this protective structure hadn't been impulsive or vindictive. It had emerged gradually as I'd recognized the growing disconnect between the partnership we projected to the world and the reality of our marriage. Harrison had always been somewhat careless with financial details, preferring to focus on the creative aspects of his developments while leaving the boring parts to me. For years, I'd handled this division of labor without complaint, taking pride in creating the secure foundation that enabled his vision. But something had shifted approximately 2 years ago when the Riverside Heights project had established Harrison as an up-and-coming developer worth watching. Success had changed him in subtle ways that became increasingly difficult to ignore. The first concerning signal had come when Harrison restructured his company without consulting me, despite my significant financial investment in his early projects. The second had been his casual dismissal of my suggestions for the Westlake development. Suggestions that could have prevented the cost overruns that eventually consumed most of the project's profit margin. But the moment that had truly catalyzed my strategic response had occurred during a dinner with potential investors last year. When one of them had complimented our partnership, asking about my role in Harrison's success, he had laughed lightly and responded, "Rebecca keeps things running smoothly at home so I can focus on building the business. She's not really involved in the development side." I had maintained my composed smile throughout the evening, but something had crystallized in that moment. The recognition that Harrison no longer viewed us as partners, but rather as principal and support staff. That his perception of my contribution had diminished even as his reliance on it had grown. The following week, I'd scheduled my first confidential consultation with Sophia Lynn, one of the city's most respected attorneys specializing in complex property and business structures. Not to discuss divorce, I wasn't ready to make that decision, but to explore how I might protect what I had helped build. "You're describing a common scenario," Sophia had told me during that initial meeting, her direct manner oddly comforting. "Contributions to marital success aren't always visible or equally valued, particularly when they come in the form of infrastructure rather than spotlighted achievements." Together, we had developed a multi-phase strategy. First, documenting my financial contributions to Harrison's business ventures and our property acquisitions. Second, establishing Oakmont Holdings as a separate legal entity. And finally, creating the framework for potentially transferring our property assets to this new structure if necessary. For 12 months, this had remained contingency planning, preparation, for a scenario I hoped wouldn't materialize. But then came the appointment notification on Harrison's shared calendar. J. Phillips, Property Reassessment, 2:00 p.m. James Phillips was not a property assessor but a real estate attorney known for handling complex asset restructuring. That evening, I had implemented the final phase of Sophia's carefully structured plan, beginning the process of legally transferring our properties to Oakmont Holdings. The transfers were structured legitimately, with proper consideration and documentation, but done without announcement or discussion, mirroring Harrison's own approach to recent business decisions. Now, as I reviewed the final confirmation from Sophia, I felt no triumph or vindication, only a profound sadness that our partnership had devolved to this point of strategic maneuvering. Yet beneath that sadness lay a steely determination. I had contributed equally to everything we had built, often sacrificing my own professional advancement to support Harrison's dreams. I would not allow those contributions to be erased or devalued. I signed the digital documents, officially completing the transfer of all our properties to Oakmont Holdings LLC, a company solely owned by me. The properties we had selected together, renovated together, and built our lives within were now legally secured. Whatever Harrison was planning with James Phillips would come too late. Sometimes the most effective defense is the one implemented before your opponent realizes a battle has begun. The Carlton Group presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause. From my seat in the back row of the conference room, a position I'd deliberately chosen, I watched Harrison in his element. He moved through his closing remarks with the practiced confidence that had first attracted me during our university days, seamlessly transitioning from development timelines to projected returns, his voice resonating with conviction that made even speculative figures sound like certainties. The Riverside District represents more than just another development opportunity, he concluded, gesturing toward the architectural renderings displayed on the massive screen behind him. It's a chance to transform an overlooked area into a vibrant community while delivering exceptional returns to our investment partners. As the lights came up and attendees rose to mingle, I remained seated, observing the scene with professional detachment. Harrison was immediately surrounded by potential investors, each eager to establish a personal connection with the visionary behind the ambitious project. This had always been his particular talent, inspiring others to believe in his vision, to see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. It was a skill I respected, even now. The difference was that I no longer mistook charisma for competence or promises for performance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca, there you are. Marissa Chen, Harrison's project manager, slid into the empty seat beside me. Impressive presentation, wasn't it? Very well executed, I agreed, keeping my assessment deliberately neutral. Marissa glanced toward Harrison, still engaged with investors across the room. The financial projections raised some eyebrows, though. Some of those return estimates seem ambitious. I nodded, unsurprised. Harrison has always believed in setting aspirational targets. True, but several of the Carlton partners have financial backgrounds. They'll dig deeper than most investors. She hesitated before continuing, lowering her voice slightly. He mentioned you'd reviewed the numbers, which reassured them. Your reputation carries significant weight. This revelation landed with unexpected impact. My reputation. Not as Harrison's supportive wife, but as a financial strategist whose assessment carried professional credibility. It was a reminder that outside our marriage, my expertise was recognized and valued in ways that had gradually diminished within our relationship. I provided some input, I acknowledged, but the final projections were Harrison's decision. After 15 years in financial management, including my current position as Senior Investment Director at Meridian, I'd developed an established reputation for conservative, accurate forecasting. This standing in financial circles had initially benefited Harrison's ventures, lending credibility to his more speculative proposals. Yet recently, he'd begun distancing his projects from my involvement, presenting himself as the sole architect of his success. As the event concluded and we prepared to leave, I noticed Harrison in deep conversation with Monica Shaw, a commercial real estate attorney I recognized from industry events. Their body language suggested familiarity beyond professional acquaintance. Harrison leaning slightly closer than necessary, Monica's hand briefly touching his arm as she emphasized a point. Nothing definitively inappropriate, yet sufficiently intimate to trigger that now familiar tightness in my chest. Rebecca. Harrison appeared beside me, his expression bright with the particular energy he always carried after successful presentations. The Carlton partners want us to join them for dinner to discuss next steps. You don't mind, do you? It might run late. Of course not, I replied smoothly. I have some work to finish anyway. I'd long ago perfected the art of gracious accommodation, of rearranging my schedule around Harrison's priorities. You're the best. He squeezed my arm affectionately, already turning back toward the Carlton executives. Don't wait up. As I drove home alone, I reflected on the shifting dynamics of our relationship. There had been a time when Harrison would have insisted I join these business dinners, valuing my ability to assess potential partners and identify unstated concerns. Now he seemed increasingly comfortable with my absence from these crucial conversations. The Tudor house was quiet when I arrived, the silence emphasizing its emptiness. I moved through the familiar rooms, turning on lights against the gathering darkness. This home, like all our properties, represented years of careful planning and strategic investment. Properties I'd researched, negotiations I'd led, financing I'd structured, all while Harrison focused on the creative aspects of his development. Business. In my home office, I opened my laptop and logged into the secure server where Oakmont Holdings documents were stored. The property transfers had been completed last week, the legal work executed with meticulous attention to detail. Everything we owned, everything I now owned, was documented in the files organized on my screen. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia Lynn. All recordings received and secured. Meeting tomorrow to discuss next steps? I confirmed the appointment before turning to the window, gazing out at the manicured grounds illuminated by strategic landscape lighting, another project I'd overseen while Harrison focused on more important matters. The property looked peaceful in the evening light, giving no indication of the invisible reconfiguration of ownership that had transpired over recent weeks. The doorbell interrupted my thoughts. Opening the front door, I found Claire Bennett, my closest friend since college and managing partner at her family's investment firm. I brought reinforcements, she announced, holding up a bottle of Cabernet. Figured you could use some company tonight. As we settled in the kitchen with wine and the takeout Claire had thoughtfully brought, she studied me with the particular attention that comes from 20 years of friendship. So it's done? She asked, cutting directly to the heart of the matter as always. Claire had been my sounding board throughout this process, one of the few people who understood both my situation and the strategic response I'd implemented. Completed. Last week, I confirmed. All properties now held by Oakmont. Claire nodded slowly. And Harrison has no idea? None. He's never shown interest in the details of our property holdings or investment structures. He trusts me to handle the boring financial stuff while he focuses on his vision. I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. That trust is about to become very inconvenient for him, Claire observed, refilling our glasses. Are you prepared for his reaction when he discovers what you've done? It was the question I'd been asking myself repeatedly over recent months. Was I prepared for the confrontation that would inevitably follow? For Harrison's sense of betrayal when he realized I'd outmaneuvered him at his own game? I'm not doing this to punish Harrison, I said finally. This isn't about revenge. Then what is it about? Claire challenged gently. I considered the question carefully. wanting to articulate the complex motivation that had driven my actions. Self-preservation, I answered eventually. And recognition. For 15 years, I've been the invisible architect of our financial security. I've structured the deals, managed the risks, created the foundation that enabled Harrison's more visible success, all while being increasingly marginalized in his narrative about that success. Claire nodded, understanding evident in her expression. As a woman who had fought to establish herself in the male-dominated financial sector, she recognized the particular frustration of having contributions minimized or erased. The property transfers aren't about taking something from Harrison, I continued. They're about securing what I helped build, about ensuring that my role in creating our success isn't simply written out of the story when it no longer serves his purposes. You think he's planning to leave? Claire asked directly. I think he's positioning himself for a significant change, I replied carefully. The meetings with James Phillips, the restructuring of his company to minimize my involvement, the increasing time spent with Monica Shaw, they suggest preparation rather than impulse. Claire's expression shifted to one of professional assessment, the look she adopted when analyzing investment opportunities. What's your endgame here, Rebecca? Assuming you're right about Harrison's intentions, what outcome are you positioning for? It was the critical question, one I'd spent months contemplating. What did I ultimately want? To save my marriage? To negotiate a fair separation? To simply protect what I'd helped create? Clarity, I said finally. And choice. By securing these assets, I'm ensuring that whatever comes next happens on level ground. That any decisions about our future together or apart are made from a position of equal power, not vulnerability. Claire nodded, satisfied with this answer. Strategic rather than reactive. Very you. As she left later that evening, Claire paused at the door. Just remember something, Beck. All this legal and financial maneuvering, it's necessary, but it's just infrastructure. The real challenge will be maintaining your emotional equilibrium when everything comes to light. After she departed, I returned to my office and opened the small safe concealed behind a landscape painting, one of the few spaces in our home that remained exclusively mine. Inside was a leather portfolio containing documents I'd been gathering over the past year, emails between Harrison and James Phillips discussing asset reallocation strategies, bank statements showing transfers to accounts I hadn't established, and most recently, photographs provided by a private investigator showing Harrison and Monica Shaw entering a boutique hotel in the adjacent city. I hadn't hired the investigator out of jealousy or suspicion. I'd engaged their services to confirm a pattern I'd already identified through objective financial analysis. The emotional betrayal, while painful, was secondary to the systematic preparation for financial separation that Harrison had initiated months ago. Tomorrow's meeting with Sophia would finalize my defensive strategy, not to inflict pain or seek revenge, but to ensure that the life and assets I'd helped build weren't simply appropriated through my strategic erasure from our shared narrative. Sometimes protection requires preemption. Sometimes the most powerful position is the one your opponent doesn't realize you hold until it's too late to counter. As Harrison's text arrived, dinner running late, staying in the city tonight, I closed the safe and returned to the kitchen, where I opened my laptop to review the quarterly performance of Oakmont Holdings' portfolio. The company I'd established to protect my interests was already generating impressive returns, its strategy reflecting my investment philosophy rather than Harrison's more speculative approach. There was a certain poetic symmetry to the situation. While Harrison believed he was orchestrating my removal from our shared assets, I had already secured them through the quiet competence he had come to take for granted. The same skills he had gradually dismissed as support, rather than strategy, had enabled me to protect what I had helped build. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I worked in strategic silence, preparing for a confrontation that would reveal which of us had truly understood the architecture of power in our relationship. The morning light filtered through the study's bay windows, casting elongated shadows across the antique mahogany desk. A wedding gift from Harrison's parents that had followed us through 3 homes. I sat facing Sophia Lynn, whose impeccable charcoal suit and direct gaze projected the confident competence that had made her one of the most sought-after attorneys in the state. The registered letter was delivered to his office yesterday, Sophia confirmed, consulting her tablet. It officially notifies Mr. Reed that Oakmont Holdings has completed acquisition of all previously jointly held properties. The documentation is comprehensive, with every transfer executed according to state law and with proper consideration. I nodded, absorbing this information with outward calm that belied my internal tension. And his lawyer has received the supporting documentation? Yes. James Phillips requested the full transfer history yesterday afternoon. His paralegal seemed quite surprised by the volume of materials we provided. A slight smile crossed Sophia's typically composed features. Apparently, Mr. Phillips had assured him it would be a straightforward matter of correcting some property records. The irony wasn't lost on me. Harrison and James had likely anticipated a simple process of removing my name from our property deeds, a unilateral action that would have been legally questionable, but potentially effective if I had remained unaware until it was completed. Instead, they had discovered that the properties no longer belonged to either Harrison or me as individuals, but to Oakmont Holdings, a company in which Harrison held no interest. How long before Harrison makes direct contact? I asked, mentally preparing for the confrontation that would inevitably follow. Sophia consulted her calendar. Mr. Phillips has requested a meeting tomorrow morning. I've agreed, but suggested our offices rather than his, establishing the appropriate dynamic from the outset. I appreciated Sophia's strategic thinking. Every detail, from meeting location to document presentation, was carefully calculated to reinforce my position, not as the wronged wife seeking justice, but as the competent businesswoman protecting legitimate interests. What's your assessment of their likely approach? I asked, valuing Sophia's psychological insights as much as her legal expertise. Initial indignation, followed by attempted intimidation, concluding with reluctant negotiation, she replied without hesitation. Men like Harrison and James rely on confidence as currency. When confronted with evidence that they've been outmaneuvered, their first response is typically to question the legitimacy of the process, rather than acknowledge the strategic failure. Her assessment aligned with my expectations. Harrison's most predictable characteristic had always been his inability to recognize defeat until long after it had occurred. His persistence, admirable in pursuing development opportunities, often manifested as stubborn denial when facing personal setbacks. Remember, Sophia continued, controlling the narrative will be critical. Harrison will attempt to cast this as a betrayal, a duplicitous action taken by a vindictive spouse. Our consistent position is that Oakmont Holdings represents the formalization of your long-standing contributions to these assets, contributions that were at risk of being systematically erased. As Sophia departed with a promise to call after the Phillips meeting, I moved through the house with heightened awareness. Each room contained memories of the life Harrison and I had built together, from the kitchen where we'd celebrated his first successful development, to the living room where we'd hosted potential investors, to the garden terrace where we'd planned future projects during summer evenings. These spaces represented not just emotional investments, but strategic ones. Every property in our portfolio had been carefully selected for appreciation potential and portfolio diversification. While Harrison had envisioned their aesthetic possibilities, I had structured their financing, analyzed their market positions, and optimized their tax implications. The emotional and financial dimensions were inextricably linked. Each property, simultaneously a home and an asset, a memory repository and an investment vehicle. My phone buzzed with a message from Harrison. Meetings running late again, dinner with the Carlton team tonight to finalize investor commitments, progress updates tomorrow. The familiar message barely registered as I continued my inspection, of the house, mentally cataloging the improvements we'd made over 7 years of ownership. The kitchen renovation that had increased the property value by 12%. The energy efficiency upgrades that had reduced operating costs by 23%. The landscaping redesign that had enhanced curb appeal while reducing water consumption. Each improvement had been jointly envisioned but primarily executed through my project management while Harrison focused on his development business. In the master bedroom, I opened the walk-in closet and noted Harrison's section. The tailored suits, designer shoes, and monogrammed shirts that projected the successful developer, image he cultivated so carefully. His wardrobe had evolved over our marriage, each upgrade coinciding with a business achievement. The first custom suit after closing the Westlake development, the Italian leather shoes following the Parkview project, the collection of designer watches marking various milestones. I had encouraged these purchases, understanding their functional role in establishing credibility with investors and partners. In development circles, appearance didn't just reflect success. It anticipated it. Harrison's carefully curated image was a business asset, one I had helped construct through strategic allowances in our personal budget. Returning to my office, I reviewed the financial models I'd developed for Oakmont Holdings, projections that extended 5, 10, and 15 years into the future. Unlike Harrison's often optimistic forecasts, mine incorporated conservative growth estimates, comprehensive risk assessments, and multiple contingency scenarios. These models didn't just address property appreciation, but included detailed succession, planning, tax optimization strategies, and philanthropic integration. The company I'd established wasn't merely a defensive mechanism against Harrison's apparent plans. It represented the crystallization of my financial philosophy, the structured, sustainable approach to wealth building that had quietly underwritten Harrison's more visible ventures. A text from Claire interrupted my review. Phillips called. Bennett Partners asking questions about your role in structuring the Westlake financing. Dad shut him down elegantly. Round 1 to you. I smiled at Claire's update. The Bennett family had been instrumental in financing Harrison's early projects, largely due to my previous working relationship with Claire's father from my Meridian days. That connection, like so many others that had benefited Harrison's business, had been established and maintained through my professional network, a fact Harrison had increasingly minimized in his success narrative. As evening approached, I changed into running clothes and headed out for my daily 5-mile route through the neighborhood. Physical activity had become my most reliable stress management technique during the past year of strategic planning and quiet execution. The rhythmic impact of feet against pavement, the measured control of breathing, the progressive building of endurance, all provided apt metaphors for the disciplined approach I'd applied to protecting my interests. Halfway through my run, another text arrived, this one from Harrison's assistant Emily. Mr. Reed asked me to inform you that he'll be staying at the downtown apartment tonight after the investor dinner. He'll return tomorrow afternoon to collect materials for his Chicago trip. The downtown apartment, our second property, purchased 3 years ago as both investment and convenience during late client meetings. Now technically owned by Oakmont Holdings, though Harrison remained unaware of this transfer. His choice to stay there tonight rather than return home registered as significant, another data point suggesting his progressive detachment. As I completed my run and cooled down, in the fading light, a vehicle turned into our driveway, a black sedan I didn't recognize. The driver's door opened, and Monica Shaw emerged, her expression registering surprise at finding me outside the house. Rebecca, she acknowledged, her tone professionally neutral despite the obvious awkwardness of our encounter. I was just dropping off some contracts for Harrison to review before tomorrow's meeting. Harrison isn't here, I replied calmly. He's staying downtown tonight after the investor dinner. Monica's momentary confusion confirmed my suspicion that her arrival wasn't expected, at least not by Harrison. She quickly recovered, however. I'll leave them with you then. She retrieved a manila envelope from the passenger seat and approached. maintaining a careful professional distance. These need his signature by tomorrow morning. I accepted the envelope, noting the Phillips and Wexler letterhead, James Phillips's firm. I'll make sure he receives them. As she turned to leave, professional courtesy compelled me to add, "You might try the downtown apartment. His assistant mentioned he'd be staying there tonight." Monica paused briefly, something unreadable crossing her features before she nodded. "Thank you. Good evening, Rebecca." After she departed, I examined the envelope, considering whether to open it. Professional ethics competed with personal preservation. These documents likely related to Harrison's attempted property transfers, making them directly relevant to my interests. After careful deliberation, I left the envelope sealed. My strategy didn't require intercepting their communications, only understanding their likely contents. Inside, I showered and changed before settling at my desk to review Sophia's preparation notes for tomorrow's meeting. The confrontation phase was approaching, the moment when my quiet strategic maneuvering would transition to direct engagement. While I hadn't initiated this conflict, I had positioned myself to navigate it from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. My phone rang, Harrison's name appearing on the screen. I answered with deliberate neutrality. "Rebecca." His voice carried that particular tension I recognized from difficult business situations. "I've just had a rather extraordinary conversation with James Phillips. Something about property transfers and a company called Oakmont Holdings. Would you care to explain?" The moment of revelation had arrived earlier than anticipated. I took a measured breath before responding. "I'd be happy to discuss Oakmont Holdings, Harrison. Would you prefer to have that conversation now by phone or tomorrow in person with our respective legal representation?" A momentary silence followed, Harrison processing the implication that I was fully prepared for this confrontation rather than caught off guard by it. "I'll be home in 30 minutes, he stated flatly. "This isn't a legal matter, it's a discussion between husband and wife." "I disagree," I replied calmly. "When you engaged James Phillips to remove my name from our property deeds without my knowledge or consent, you transformed this from a marital matter to a legal one. But I'm available if you'd like to come home now." Another silence, longer this time. Then, 30 minutes, he repeated before ending the call. I texted Sophia a brief update, received her confirmation that she remained available if needed, then moved to the kitchen to prepare tea. A small ritual that had always helped me maintain composure during challenging situations. The confrontation I had anticipated for months was imminent. The strategic groundwork had been laid, the protective mechanisms established. Now came the human element, the emotional exchange that would determine whether our relationship could be renegotiated on more equitable terms or would proceed toward dissolution. As headlights swept across the driveway announcing Harrison's arrival, I felt not anxiety, but clarity. Whatever transpired in the coming hours would occur on level ground, each of us negotiating from positions of comparable strength. The invisible imbalance that had gradually distorted our partnership had been corrected through my quiet intervention. Sometimes the most empowering victory isn't domination, but restoration of equilibrium, creating conditions where genuine choice becomes possible. Again, the front door opened with that distinctive sound I'd grown accustomed to over 15 years of marriage. Harrison's particular way of entering our home after difficult meetings, the door closing with slightly more force than necessary. It wasn't anger exactly, but a physical manifestation of internal pressure seeking release. I remained seated at the kitchen island, teacup poised halfway to my lips, presenting an image of composed readiness rather than anxious anticipation. The subtle positioning of power often determines the trajectory of confrontation as much as the substantive issues at stake. Harrison appeared in the doorway, still wearing his business attire, though his tie had been loosened and his typically immaculate hair showed signs of agitated fingers running through it. His expression registered surprise at finding me so calmly waiting, as though he'd expected to discover me frantically making calls or perhaps packing belongings. Would you like some tea? I offered, gesturing toward the pot I'd prepared. The banality of the question in the context of our situation wasn't lost on either of us. No. He moved into the kitchen but remained standing, maintaining height advantage while I stayed seated. I want an explanation. James Phillips informs me that our properties, all of them, have somehow been transferred to a company I've never heard of. A company apparently owned by you. I took another sip of tea before responding, the small action reinforcing my unhurried approach. That's correct. Oakmont Holdings completed acquisition of our property portfolio approximately 3 weeks ago. The transfers were executed with proper legal documentation and consideration. Consideration? Harrison's voice rose slightly. You mean you paid yourself for our properties? Properties we purchased together? Not exactly, I corrected. Oakmont Holdings provided legitimate consideration for the transfers, including assumption of existing mortgages and additional capital investment. And to clarify, these weren't properties we purchased together in the way you're implying. I rose and moved to my briefcase on the counter, extracting a leather portfolio that contained printed copies of the documentation Sophia had prepared. Each property was researched, negotiated, and primarily financed through my separate assets, with transaction structures I designed. Your contributions, while valuable, were primarily related to renovation direction and usage planning. Harrison's expression shifted from indignation to disbelief as I placed the portfolio on the counter between us. This is absurd. We're married. We built this portfolio together as part of our shared life. That was certainly my understanding. As well, I acknowledged, maintaining professional rather than emotional tone. Until approximately 10 months ago when you began meeting with James Phillips to discuss, and I quote from your email correspondence, strategies for securing exclusive control of jointly held assets in preparation for significant life changes. The color drained slightly from Harrison's face as he recognized his own phrasing quoted back to him. You've been monitoring my emails? No, I replied truthfully. I received copies inadvertently when you used our shared cloud storage for document backups. Once I discovered your intentions, I took appropriate steps to protect my interests, exactly as you were attempting to do, though with greater attention to legal requirements and documentation. Harrison's posture changed, his initial aggressive confidence giving way to strategic reassessment. This was the business tactician I knew well, the developer who could pivot quickly when initial approaches proved ineffective. Rebecca, he began, his tone shifting toward reasonable conciliation. Clearly there's been a misunderstanding. Those discussions with James were theoretical explorations of asset protection strategies, standard estate planning considerations. That would be more credible, I responded evenly, if they hadn't coincided with the establishment of your separate banking accounts, the systematic reduction of my involvement in your business operations, and your developing personal relationship with Monica Shaw. At Monica's name, Harrison's expression betrayed genuine surprise. What does Monica have to do with this? Perhaps nothing directly, I acknowledged, though her arrival at our home this evening with Phillips and Wexler documents suggests at least professional involvement in whatever restructuring you've been planning. I opened the portfolio, revealing organized sections with color-coded tabs. However, Monica isn't particularly relevant to our discussion. What matters is this documentation, which establishes the legitimate transfer of properties to Oakmont Holdings based on capital contribution analysis, management responsibility records, and improvement investment tracking. Harrison approached the counter, his gaze fixed on the meticulous records I'd compiled. Financial statements highlighting my contributions to property acquisitions, project management documentation for renovations I'd overseen, email threads recording strategic decisions I'd initiated regarding property selection, financing structure, and portfolio optimization. You've been planning this for months, he said finally, more statement than accusation. I've been documenting my contributions for years, I corrected, initially as responsible financial record-keeping, later as strategic protection when it became apparent those contributions might be at risk of erasure. Harrison looked up from the documentation, a new calculation evident in his expression. Assuming these transfers are legitimate, which my attorneys will certainly review, what's your objective here? What are you hoping to achieve? It was the critical question, the one that would define whether this confrontation led toward destruction or reconstruction. I'd considered various responses during months of preparation, weighing financial pragmatism against emotional authenticity. Recognition, I answered simply. Not just of my financial contributions to our property portfolio, but of my role in creating the foundation that enabled your business success. For years, I've watched that role being systematically minimized in your professional narrative and, more recently, in your personal assessment of our partnership. Harrison's defensive posture softened slightly, though his analyst's mind remained clearly engaged. And Oakmont Holdings? What's your intention with the properties? That depends on several factors, I replied, including your response to this situation. Oakmont was established primarily as a protective mechanism, not a punitive one. Its operational plan includes scenarios ranging from continued joint usage of properties to strategic liquidation and reinvestment. I closed the portfolio and met his gaze directly. The relevant question, Harrison, isn't what I intend to do with Oakmont, but what you intended to do with our properties before discovering they were no longer under your control. His momentary hesitation contained the answer, though professional pride prevented explicit acknowledgement. Instead, he shifted to the pragmatic approach that characterized his business negotiations. Clearly, we need to discuss the future of our relationship, both personal and financial. He gestured toward the kitchen table, suggesting a transition from confrontational positioning to dialogue. Perhaps we should sit down and consider options rationally. I nodded, accepting this shift toward negotiation while recognizing it as tactical rather than transformative. As we moved to the table, I maintained the composed demeanor that had proven essential throughout this process, though internally I acknowledged the bittersweet victory of the moment. Harrison was finally engaging with me as an equal strategic partner, not because he chose to, but because circumstances required it. Before we discuss specific scenarios, I began as we seated ourselves across from each other, I want to be clear about something. This situation isn't the outcome I hoped for when I established Oakmont Holdings. It represents a defensive response to your actions, not an offensive strategy I implemented by preference. Harrison considered this, his analytical mind visibly processing implications. If that's true, why not confront me directly when you discovered my discussions with James? Why the elaborate countermeasure? It was a legitimate question, one that reflected the fundamental communication failure in our relationship. Would you have taken my concerns seriously? I asked. Our recent history suggested otherwise. When I raised questions about being excluded from the Carlton Group planning sessions, you dismissed them as oversensitivity. When I expressed concerns about Monica's increasing role in your projects, you characterized it as unwarranted jealousy. Harrison had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable at these accurate recollections. I may have been dismissive of certain concerns, he acknowledged, the careful phrasing of someone conceding minimum territory in negotiation. More significantly, I continued, direct confrontation would have accelerated your timetable without ensuring my protection. By the time I discovered your intentions regarding the properties, you'd already created the infrastructure for their transfer. Confronting you then would have simply prompted immediate action on your part. The strategic logic of my approach registered in his expression, the reluctant appreciation of one tactician recognizing another's effective maneuver. Our marriage had deteriorated into adversarial positioning, each of us protecting perceived interests rather than building shared value. The recognition of this reality hung between us, unspoken but undeniable. Where do we go from here? Harrison asked finally, his tone suggesting genuine uncertainty rather than tactical positioning. I had prepared extensively for this moment, developing multiple scenarios with corresponding decision trees. Yet now, facing Harrison across our kitchen table in this pivotal conversation, I recognized that predetermining outcomes would contradict the very principle of equal partnership I sought to establish. That depends on what's actually possible. Between us now, I replied with deliberate openness. Not just legally or financially, but personally. Whether there remains sufficient trust and mutual respect to rebuild, rather than simply divide assets and proceed separately. Harrison's expression shifted subtly, something unguarded momentarily visible beneath his negotiator's mask. Do you want to rebuild, after everything that's happened? The question contained multiple dimensions. Was genuine reconciliation possible? After such fundamental breach of trust? Was it desirable given the patterns we'd established? Was it practically feasible given our now revealed strategic maneuvering against each other? I want whatever emerges from this situation to be the result of conscious choice rather than power imbalance, I answered carefully. With Oakmont Holdings securing my contributions, we now have the opportunity to make decisions from equal positions, whether those decisions lead toward reconstruction of our partnership or its thoughtful dissolution. Harrison nodded slowly, professional respect evident despite the personal complexity between us. Equal negotiating positions, he acknowledged. Though I suspect my bargaining leverage has been significantly compromised by James's approach, which appears to have been both ethically questionable and legally insufficient. James was implementing your instructions, I reminded him gently. The responsibility for that strategy ultimately rests with the client, not the attorney. This simple truth landed with visible impact. Harrison had built his reputation on AI, assuming personal responsibility for his business decisions, whether successful or problematic. The attempt to distance himself from the property transfer strategy represented an uncharacteristic evasion that conflicted with his core professional identity. You're right, he conceded, straightening slightly as though physically reclaiming his integrity. The approach was my decision, based on assumptions that have proven incorrect. He paused, seeming to struggle with the next acknowledgement. Assumptions about your awareness, your capabilities, and your response. This admission, however, limited, created an opening for potential reconstruction. Not of our previous relationship. That particular configuration had been irrevocably altered. But perhaps of something new, built on more accurate mutual assessment. I propose we take 24 hours to consider our respective positions, I suggested, offering structure to channel the emotional complexity of our situation. Then meet tomorrow evening with clear perspectives on what each of us truly wants. Going forward, not just regarding property ownership, but our relationship itself. Harrison agreed, professional pragmatism reasserting itself. As he rose to leave, returning to the downtown apartment that now technically belonged to Oakmont Holdings, he paused at the kitchen doorway. For what it's worth, he said without turning fully toward me, I underestimated you, Rebecca. Not just recently, but consistently throughout our marriage. That miscalculation reflects my limitations, not yours. After he departed, I remained at the kitchen table, reflecting on the interaction. The confrontation had unfolded neither as catastrophically as I'd feared, nor as transformatively as I'd hoped, in more optimistic moments. Instead, it had established a new reality between us, one characterized by mutual recognition of capability and strategic parity. Whether that new reality could support reconciliation remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that I would approach that decision from a position of strength rather than vulnerability, of choice rather than necessity. In preparing for the worst outcome, I had created the conditions for the best possible decision process, regardless of where that process ultimately led. Sometimes the most significant victory isn't getting everything you want, but creating circumstances where what you truly need becomes possible. The 24 hours following our confrontation unfolded with a particular quality of suspended animation, life continuing its outward rhythms while fundamental structures were being reassessed beneath the surface. I maintained my professional schedule, attending a quarterly review meeting at Meridian Financial, where I presented portfolio performance analyses with my characteristic precision, despite the personal earthquake reshaping my private landscape. My colleagues noticed nothing unusual. The composed, analytical Rebecca Reed they'd worked with for years appeared unchanged, offering incisive market assessments, identifying overlooked investment opportunities, constructing risk mitigation strategies for high-net-worth clients. This seamless performance wasn't pretense but compartmentalization, a skill I'd refined through years of maintaining professional excellence regardless of personal circumstances. Between meetings, I received a message from Sophia, updating me on developments with James Phillips. Phillips requesting conference call to discuss mutual resolution framework, offering significant concessions regarding business interests in Naituaisai, exchange for property reconsideration, recommend maintaining position while exploring terms. The message confirmed my assessment of Harrison's likely approach, strategic retreat on property claims counterbalanced by attempts to secure his business interests, which remained potentially vulnerable given my documented financial contributions to several key development projects. This wasn't surprising. Harrison's primary identity had always been professional rather than personal. Preserving his business reputation and operational independence would naturally outweigh property considerations once he recognized the legal strength of my position. After completing my workday, I returned to the Tudor home to prepare for our upcoming conversation. The house felt different now, not just because of Harrison's absence, but because my relationship to the space had fundamentally shifted. What had been our home was now objectively an asset of Oakmont Holdings, a property I controlled through legal structure rather than marital convention. This transformation from shared domain to strategic asset created a curious emotional distance even as I moved through familiar rooms. In the study, I reviewed the comprehensive documentation Sophia had prepared outlining various scenarios for resolution. The options ranged from complete separation of assets and interests to restructured partnership models that would maintain certain connections while establishing clear boundaries and protections. Each scenario included detailed financial projections, tax implications, and governance frameworks. The measured, analytical approach that had characterized my financial management throughout our marriage now applied to its potential conclusion. At precisely 7 o'clock, Harrison arrived, the punctuality reflecting his business approach rather than personal habit. He'd always been carelessly approximate about time in our personal life, but meticulously precise in professional contexts. His choice to arrive exactly when specified suggested he viewed our conversation primarily as negotiation rather than relationship discussion. "Thank you for coming," I greeted him in the entryway, maintaining professional courtesy without artificial warmth. "I've prepared some materials in the study if you'd like to review them together." Harrison nodded, following me through the house with the heightened awareness of someone seeing familiar surroundings through transformed perspective. In the study, I'd arranged documents on the partner's desk we'd selected during a trip to London. Years earlier, an antique piece designed for collaborative work with identical positions on either side. The symbolic equality of this setting was intentional, establishing visual reinforcement of our new dynamic. As we settled into position, Harrison placed a leather folder on the desk between us. "I've also prepared some materials," he said, opening it to reveal professionally bound documents. Alternative scenarios for consideration. I recognized the format immediately, the same presentation approach Harrison used for development proposals, complete with executive summary, detailed analysis, and visual representations of key concepts. He had applied his professional methodology to our personal situation, just as I had applied my financial analysis framework. The parallel was both fitting and telling. each of us processing this deeply personal situation through our respective professional lenses. Before we exchange proposals, Harrison began, his tone deliberately measured, I want to acknowledge something. My actions regarding the property transfers were not just legally questionable, but fundamentally disrespectful of your contributions to our shared life and my professional success. The admission was unexpected, not because it wasn't true, but because Harrison rarely acknowledged missteps so directly. In business contexts, he typically reframed challenges as learning opportunities or strategic pivots, rather than errors in judgment. I appreciate that acknowledgement, I responded, recognizing its significance without over-investing in its implications. It helps establish a foundation for productive discussion. Harrison nodded, seemingly relieved by my professional rather than emotional response. In preparing for our conversation, I've been reviewing our financial history more comprehensively than I have in years, perhaps ever. He opened one of his presentation documents, revealing a timeline chart tracking the growth of his development business alongside our property acquisitions. The correlation between key business advances and your financial interventions is unmistakable once properly analyzed. The chart highlighted specific instances where my capital infusions, financial restructuring, or strategic connections had directly enabled Harrison's business achievements, from the initial launch capital I'd provided from my inheritance to the Bennett family investment I'd secured for the Westlake project, to the tax optimization strategy I'd implemented that had preserved capital during the downtown development's cost overruns. Your analysis is accurate, I confirmed, unsurprised by the data but noteworthy by his willingness to acknowledge it explicitly. Those interventions represented my commitment to our partnership and belief in your vision, even when that vision required significant financial adaptation. They represented more than that, Harrison corrected, surprising me with this perspective shift. They demonstrated financial acumen and strategic capability I've consistently undervalued. The Westlake refinancing structure alone prevented potential bankruptcy during the construction delays. That wasn't just supportive partnership. It was sophisticated financial engineering that even James acknowledged was exceptional. This recognition of my professional capability, not just as auxiliary support but as fundamental expertise, represented the specific acknowledgement I'd identified as essential during my strategic planning. Yet I found myself cautious about its significance, aware that recognition during negotiation might reflect tactical positioning rather than genuine perspective transformation. What matters now, I responded, redirecting toward concrete considerations, is how this recognition informs our path forward. I've outlined several potential frameworks, each with different implications for our personal and professional relationship. I opened my scenario document, which presented 3 primary options with corresponding financial projections and governance structures. The first scenario involves complete separation, division of interests with minimal ongoing connection beyond necessary legal requirements. The second establishes a restructured partnership with clearly defined boundaries, independent, decision authority in respective domains, and formalized consultation protocols for overlapping interests. The third creates an integrated but transformed relationship structure with comprehensive transparency requirements and equitable value attribution mechanisms. Harrison studied the scenarios with analytical attention, his expression revealing neither preference nor resistance. After several minutes of review, he looked up with the particular focus that characterized his approach to complex negotiations. These are thorough and thoughtfully constructed, he acknowledged. My scenarios overlap considerably with your second and third options, though with different emphasis on certain elements. He turned his proposal document toward me. I focused particularly on business continuity considerations while providing for appropriate attribution and compensation for historical contributions. What followed was perhaps the most genuine and substantive discussion of our 15-year relationship. not framed in emotional terms of expectations and disappointments, but through the clarifying lens of value creation, contribution assessment, and governance structure. We examined our shared history as analysts rather than spouses, identifying patterns, acknowledging imbalances, and evaluating potential future configurations based on objective criteria rather than emotional attachment. The process was simultaneously foreign and familiar. Applying our professional capabilities to our personal situation created both clarity and distance. Like anatomists dissecting a once-living organism, we gained unprecedented understanding of our relationship structure, while necessarily approaching it as something separate from ourselves. After nearly 3 hours of methodical analysis and scenario evaluation, we reached the natural boundary of what could be productively addressed in a single session. The fundamental question, whether to separate completely or attempt reconstructed partnership, remained unresolved, but the parameters of either choice had been clearly established. "I believe we've made significant progress," Harrison observed as we concluded, gathering his materials with characteristic precision. "We've established mutual understanding of historical patterns and defined viable frameworks for potential resolution." "Yes," I agreed, recognizing the achievement while maintaining appropriate perspective. "Though we should acknowledge that tonight's discussion has focused primarily on structural considerations rather than the underlying question of whether reconstruction is personally desirable for either of us." Harrison paused in his organizational process, something vulnerable briefly visible beneath his professional demeanor. "That's a fair observation. The structural analysis comes more naturally to both of us than the personal assessment." He hesitated before adding, "For whatever it's worth, I found our interaction tonight more engaging and substantive than many of our conversations in recent years." The comment contained an inadvertent revelation that Harrison found intellectual engagement more compelling than emotional connection, that he valued my analytical capabilities more highly than the supportive partnership role I'd increasingly assumed in our relationship. This insight illuminated both the original attraction between us and the gradual misalignment that had developed as I'd subordinated my strategic identity to supportive functionality within our marriage. "I've had a similar experience," I acknowledged, recognizing the implications of this mutual realization. Perhaps because we're engaging as equals rather than through the asymmetrical dynamic that had developed in our relationship. Harrison nodded, accepting this assessment without defensiveness. "Would you be open to continuing this discussion tomorrow? I'd like to review these scenarios more thoroughly and develop some additional considerations regarding the business integration options." We established a follow-up meeting for the following evening, maintaining the structured approach that had proven productive. As Harrison prepared to leave, he paused near the study doorway, his expression reflecting unusual uncertainty. "Rebecca," he began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "I realize that my actions regarding the properties have likely damaged your trust beyond simple repair. Whatever framework we ultimately establish, I want you to know that I recognize the fundamental unfairness of how I've approached our partnership in recent years." The acknowledgement was meaningful but incomplete, focusing on fairness rather than emotional impact on partnership structure rather than personal betrayal. Yet it represented genuine recognition within Harrison's capability for self-reflection, an acknowledgement of imbalance that would have been unthinkable before my strategic intervention through Oakmont Holdings. After his departure, I remained in the study, contemplating the evening's discussion. The analytical exercise had clarified potential structural resolutions, but left the essential emotional question unaddressed. Not whether reconstruction was possible, but whether it was desirable given what we now understood about our fundamental orientations toward partnership. The properties secured through Oakmont Holdings had accomplished their primary purpose, creating the conditions for equal negotiation and mutual recognition. What remained uncertain was whether that equality could support meaningful relationship, reconstruction, or would simply facilitate more equitable separation. That question couldn't be answered through strategic analysis, but required honest assessment of personal values, needs, and aspirations beyond financial considerations. As I prepared for sleep in the house that now legally belonged to my company rather than my marriage, I recognized that the most significant outcome of my strategic intervention wasn't the preservation of property rights, but the restoration of authentic choice, the freedom to determine my future based on genuine preference rather than vulnerable necessity. Sometimes the greatest achievement isn't securing specific outcomes, but creating conditions where meaningful choice becomes possible. By protecting what I had helped build, I had reclaimed not just property rights but decision autonomy. The foundational requirement for any authentic relationship, whether continuing or concluding. The following morning brought unexpected clarity. I awoke before dawn, a lifetime habit developed during my early career at Meridian when market analysis required early starts to prepare for morning trading decisions. The house remained silent. As I moved through my morning routine with practiced efficiency, stretching exercises followed by 30 minutes of meditation, then a light breakfast while reviewing market updates on my tablet. This morning ritual had remained consistent regardless of circumstances, a foundation of stability I'd maintained through market volatility, Harrison's business crises, and more recently, the strategic implementation of my protective measures. The discipline wasn't merely about productivity, but identity preservation, maintaining core practices that defined me beyond relational roles or professional titles. As I sipped freshly brewed coffee on the garden terrace, watching dawn light gradually illuminate the carefully landscaped grounds, a realization crystallized with unexpected clarity. I felt more authentically myself than I had in years. The protective measures I'd implemented through Oakmont Holdings had been conceived primarily as financial safeguards, strategic defense against Harrison's apparent plans to separate me from jointly created assets. Yet their most significant impact had been psychological rather than financial. By securing what I had helped build, I had inadvertently liberated myself from the accommodating patterns that had gradually diminished my presence in our relationship. My phone signaled an incoming message, Sophia confirming our scheduled update call later that morning. As I responded to her text, another notification appeared. An email from Marcus Bennett, Claire's brother and managing director at Bennett Investment Partners. The subject line read simply, Opportunity Discussion, Confidential. The email's contents were intriguing. Bennett Partners was establishing a new division focused on strategic property portfolio management for high-net-worth clients, combining real estate investment with sophisticated financial structuring. Marcus proposed a meeting to discuss potential collaboration, noting that my work with Oakmont Holdings demonstrated exactly the integrated approach they hoped to develop. This invitation represented something I hadn't anticipated: recognition of my strategic capabilities beyond Meridian's traditional investment framework. Bennett Partners was among the city's most respected investment firms, known for innovative approaches to wealth management and exclusive client relationships. Their interests suggested that what I had created as protective measure might have broader application and potential. I marked the email for careful consideration later, turning my attention to preparation for the day's professional commitments. Yet the possibility it represented lingered in my thoughts, a potential path forward that existed independently of my relationship resolution with Harrison. The morning proceeded with a productive call with Sophia, who updated me on discussions with James Phillips. He's proposed a structured settlement framework acknowledging Oakmont's property ownership while requesting certain usage rights for Harrison related to the downtown apartment and considerations regarding the commercial building housing his first development office. The commercial building carries significant emotional value for Harrison, I acknowledged, remembering his pride when we'd acquired the property that housed his first successful project. I'm open to arrangements that respect that connection while maintaining appropriate legal and financial structures. That's helpful perspective, Sophia noted. There's also indication they're preparing a more comprehensive proposal regarding the business interests. specifically addressing your historical contributions to his development projects and appropriate compensation structures. This aligned with my expectation that Harrison would prioritize business continuity and independence over property considerations once he recognized the legal strength of Oakmont's position. Our conversation the previous evening had confirmed his primary identity remained anchored in his development business, the visible manifestation of his creative vision and professional achievement. After completing the call with Sophia, I continued my workday at Meridian, maintaining professional focus despite the personal recalibration occurring beneath the surface. Between client meetings, I received a message from Harrison. Reviewing. Proposal frameworks. Would like to discuss alternative approach tonight. 7 p.m. still works? I confirmed the meeting time, noting the deliberate ambiguity of alternative approach without requesting clarification. The negotiation process had established a rhythm, each of us preparing positions independently before engaging in structured discussion. This approach bypassed emotional reactivity in favor of thoughtful consideration, creating space for strategic rather than defensive responses. The remainder of the day passed in productive routine, though with a subtle shift in my perspective on long-term client relationships. Conversations about wealth preservation and growth strategy that had previously registered as purely professional now carried additional resonance, each interaction illuminating patterns of value recognition and decision authority that paralleled aspects of my personal situation. When I returned home that evening, I took time to change from business attire into more casual but still professional clothing, a conscious choice reflecting the evolving nature of our discussions from formal negotiation toward collaborative problem-solving. The subtle shift in presentation signaled openness to reconstruction possibilities without abandoning the equal positioning I'd established. Harrison arrived precisely at 7, carrying both his leather portfolio and, unexpectedly, a bottle of Barolo from a small Italian vineyard we'd visited during our 10th anniversary trip. The wine represented a gesture toward our shared history, not sentimentally overweighted, but acknowledging connection beyond strategic considerations. I thought this might be appropriate, he offered as I welcomed him, given that tonight's discussion involves reviewing our history with fresh perspective. We moved to the kitchen rather than the study, another subtle shift in environment from formal negotiation to more integrated discussion. As I retrieved wine glasses from the cabinet, Harrison placed several documents on the kitchen island, including materials I hadn't seen in previous exchanges. Before we begin, he said as I poured the wine, I want to share something I discovered during my review process. He slid a document toward me. A financial analysis I'd prepared 5 years earlier projecting growth strategies for his development business. The margins contained Harrison's handwritten notes from that period, including comments about Rebecca's financial engineering genius and implement all recommendations immediately. I found this in my archived files, he explained. It reminded me how explicitly I once recognized your strategic capabilities, even documenting that recognition. In my planning notes, somewhere along the way, I stopped acknowledging what I clearly understood earlier in our relationship. The document represented tangible evidence of what had gradually eroded in our partnership, not just appreciation, but active recognition of value contribution. Seeing Harrison's contemporaneous notes acknowledging my genius contrasted painfully with his recent dismissive characterization of my role as keeping things running smoothly at home. Thank you for sharing this, I said, accepting the document's significance without over-interpreting its implications for our current situation. It provides helpful context for understanding our relationship evolution. Harrison nodded, seemingly appreciative of my measured response. It's part of a broader reassessment I've been conducting, not just of our financial structures, but of the partnership patterns we established. That reassessment has led me to consider an alternative approach to our situation. He opened his portfolio and removed a document different from his previous proposals. not the bound presentation format of business negotiations, but something more akin to architectural blueprints, with interconnected elements and structural relationships mapped in visual format. "This is a reconstruction blueprint," he explained, spreading the document between us. "Not just of our legal and financial relationships, but of our partnership architecture itself. It addresses not only asset distribution and management rights, but fundamentally reconceived interaction protocols and value recognition mechanisms." The blueprint was unlike anything I'd seen in our previous exchanges, a comprehensive visualization of relationship reconstruction that incorporated elements from both our scenario proposals while introducing entirely new concepts. It mapped specific domains of autonomous decision authority alongside collaborative engagement frameworks, establishing clear boundaries while maintaining strategic integration points. Most significantly, it explicitly acknowledged value generation asymmetry correction, formal recognition that contribution takes multiple forms beyond visible leadership, including the strategic infrastructure development and risk management I had provided throughout our relationship. This correction mechanism included both retrospective acknowledgement and prospective implementation requirements. "This is surprisingly comprehensive," I observed, studying the blueprint's interconnected elements. "It addresses structural issues I hadn't explicitly included in my scenarios. I approached it as I would a development project with fundamental architectural challenges," Harrison explained. "Not just addressing surface features, but reimagining the underlying support structure." He hesitated before adding, "Though I recognize that structural redesign doesn't necessarily address the emotional impact of my actions." The acknowledgement was significant. Harrison rarely addressed emotional dimensions directly, typically focusing on strategic solutions to relationship challenges rather than their psychological impact. His willingness to acknowledge this limitation represented genuine growth rather than tactical positioning. "The blueprint provides a thoughtful framework," I acknowledged. "But you're right that structural redesign alone doesn't address trust. Reconstruction. That requires demonstrated behavior change over time, not just architectural re-engineering." Harrison nodded, accepting this reality without defensive response. "I understand that. This blueprint isn't presented as complete solution, but as foundational framework upon which trust might potentially be rebuilt through consistent implementation and demonstrated commitment." As we discussed specific elements of the reconstruction blueprint, I found myself engaged by its thoughtful integration of lessons from our confrontation. The framework explicitly addressed power imbalances, contribution recognition, and decision authority in ways that reflected genuine understanding of what had deteriorated in our relationship. It wasn't merely compromise, but reimagination, a fundamentally different approach to partnership based on mutual recognition rather than complementary role division. Yet I remained cautious about its emotional implications. Architectural redesign could address structural flaws, but not necessarily heal the breach of trust created by Harrison's attempted property transfers and his developing relationship with Monica Shaw, aspects of our situation that remained inadequately addressed in our discussions. "The blueprint offers promising structural framework," I acknowledged after thorough review. "But implementation would require addressing several unresolved questions." I took a measured sip of wine before continuing. "Including your relationship with Monica Shaw and whatever significant life changes prompted your consultation with James Phillips." Harrison's expression shifted subtly, the negotiations specialist momentarily giving way to more authentic discomfort. "That's fair," he conceded. "Complete reconstruction requires addressing those elements directly." He set down his wine glass with deliberate care. "My relationship with Monica began as purely professional collaboration, but developed emotional dimensions over time. That development reflected problems in our marriage rather than causing them, though that doesn't justify the lack of transparency. The acknowledgement was meaningful but incomplete, acknowledging the relationship's existence without clarifying its current status or future intentions. I maintained neutral expression while processing both the information and its delivery. Factual acknowledgement without emotional context. And the significant life changes referenced in your communications with James, I prompted, maintaining focus on comprehensive understanding rather than reactive response. Harrison hesitated, seemingly weighing how directly to address this question. Initially, I was considering separation, he acknowledged finally. The changes referenced were primarily related to establishing independent living and business arrangements while minimizing financial entanglements. And now? I asked, the simple question containing complex dimensions. Now, Harrison replied with unusual directness. I'm reassessing whether separation represents necessary response to relationship challenges versus potential avoidance of partnership recalibration. The process of developing this reconstruction blueprint has clarified that our foundational compatibility remains strong despite implementation failures. The statement was characteristically Harrison: analytical assessment of emotional questions, strategic framing of relationship considerations. Yet it contained genuine reflection absent from his earlier positioning, suggesting authentic reconsideration rather than tactical adjustment. As our discussion continued into the evening, exploring both structural elements of the reconstruction blueprint and the emotional dimensions requiring attention, I found myself genuinely engaged by the possibility space we were creating. Not naively optimistic about relationship restoration, but intellectually stimulated by the challenge of reimagining partnership architecture based on mutual value recognition. What remained unclear was whether this architectural redesign could sufficiently address the emotional breach that had occurred, whether intellectual engagement with reconstruction possibilities could translate into authentic trust restoration. The framework Harrison had developed demonstrated genuine understanding of structural imbalances, but couldn't itself regenerate the essential foundation of partnership. The belief that both parties are fundamentally committed to mutual benefit, rather than strategic advantage. As Harrison prepared to leave, having established framework for continued exploration of the reconstruction blueprint, he paused in a moment of uncharacteristic vulnerability. I recognize that my actions created damage that may prove irreparable, regardless of structural redesign. This blueprint isn't presented with expectation of forgiveness, but as demonstration of genuine reassessment. The statement contained no tactical positioning or negotiation leverage, simply authentic acknowledgement of reality without presumption of outcome. This authenticity, more than the reconstruction blueprint itself, created space for considering genuine partnership renewal rather than merely equitable separation. After Harrison's departure, I returned to the kitchen island where the blueprint remained spread open, its interconnected elements mapping possible reconstruction pathways. The document represented something I hadn't anticipated when establishing Oakmont Holdings as protective measure: the possibility that securing what I had built might create conditions not just for equitable separation, but for fundamental relationship transformation. The future remained unwritten, multiple pathways still viable depending on implementation evidence and emotional recalibration capacity. What had fundamentally changed wasn't the certainty of outcome, but the conditions of choice, the liberation from vulnerability creating space for authentic decision-making based on genuine preference rather than protective necessity. The email from Marcus Bennett continued to occupy my thoughts over the following days. While Harrison and I proceeded with our structured discussions about the reconstruction blueprint, exploring implementation frameworks and accountability mechanisms, the Bennett Partners opportunity represented something different: a professional path based on recognition of my strategic capabilities rather than relationship recalibration. After careful consideration, I scheduled a preliminary meeting with Marcus to explore the concept further. We met at a discreet cafe in the financial district, away from both Meridian's offices and Harrison's usual business locations. Thank you for making time, Rebecca, Marcus greeted me, his manner reflecting the Bennett family's characteristic blend of professional formality and personal warmth. Claire speaks very highly of your strategic approach with Oakmont Holdings. Claire has been an invaluable sounding board throughout that process, I acknowledged, appreciating her brother's recognition of my strategic work rather than focusing on the personal circumstances that had necessitated it. Marcus nodded, setting a folder on the table between us. What you created as protective measure has broader application potential. The integration of property portfolio management with sophisticated financial structuring represents an emerging opportunity space few firms are properly addressing. He opened the folder, revealing market analysis documenting increasing demand for integrated property and financial management services among high-net-worth clients. Traditional wealth management typically separates these functions, creating inefficiencies and missed optimization opportunities. Your work with Oakmont demonstrates practical implementation of the integrated approach we're developing. The opportunity Marcus outlined was compelling. A division director position leading Bennett Partners' new integrated wealth management initiative, with substantial autonomy and profit participation. The role would leverage both my financial expertise from Meridian and the property management capabilities I'd developed through Oakmont Holdings. This isn't just about your technical capabilities, Marcus added, demonstrating the perceptiveness that had made Bennett Partners so successful. It's about your proven ability to execute sophisticated strategic vision while maintaining composure under significant pressure. Not everyone could have navigated your recent situation with such methodical effectiveness. His recognition of the psychological dimensions of my Oakmont strategy, the disciplined implementation under emotional pressure, resonated more deeply than acknowledgement of technical expertise alone. This understanding of strategic execution as both intellectual and psychological achievement reflected genuine appreciation of what I had accomplished. I'm genuinely interested in exploring this further, I responded, careful to maintain appropriate boundaries while expressing authentic interest. The integration approach aligns with my own thinking about wealth management evolution. Would you be open to providing more detailed information about structural implementation plans and client acquisition strategy? Marcus smiled, seemingly pleased by my focus on substantive dimensions rather than compensation or title considerations. Absolutely. I'll have our development team prepare comprehensive briefing materials for your review. As we concluded our meeting, Marcus extended his hand with professional respect. Whatever you decide regarding this opportunity, Rebecca, I want you to know that what you've built with Oakmont is genuinely impressive. Taking protective action is common. Doing so with strategic sophistication that creates future optionality is exceptional. This validation from a respected industry leader, someone with no personal stake in my relationship situation, carried particular weight. It confirmed that what I had created extended beyond defensive reaction to represent genuine strategic achievement with broader application potential. Returning to my office at Meridian, I found myself viewing my current position through transformed perspective. The senior director role I'd worked toward for years suddenly seemed constrained, focused on implementing established investment approaches rather than creating innovative frameworks. The Bennett opportunity represented not just career advancement, but evolution toward more integrated application of my capabilities. That evening, Harrison and I continued our discussion of the reconstruction blueprint, focusing on implementation, sequencing, and verification mechanisms. As we worked through operational details of the partnership restructuring, I found myself engaged by the intellectual challenge while maintaining emotional perspective about relationship implications. I've been thinking about the value recognition element, Harrison noted, referencing a core component of the reconstruction framework. Beyond retrospective acknowledgement, we need ongoing attribution mechanisms that prevent future imbalance, regression. The observation demonstrated genuine understanding of a critical issue, that formal acknowledgement of past contribution wouldn't itself prevent future pattern recurrence without structural reinforcement. This insight reflected Harrison's architectural thinking applied to relationship dynamics rather than physical spaces. Agreed, I responded, appreciating the substantive focus. Sustainability requires embedded equilibrium maintenance rather than periodic correction. As our discussion progressed, I found myself increasingly confident in my capacity to engage with Harrison as equal partner rather than supporting contributor. This confidence wasn't reactive assertion, but grounded self-assessment, recognition that my strategic capabilities warranted equal standing in both professional and personal contexts. "There's something I should mention," I said during a natural transition point in our discussion. "I've received a professional opportunity that I'm exploring, a division leadership position with Bennett Partners focusing on integrated wealth management." Harrison's expression registered genuine surprise, followed by thoughtful consideration. "That sounds aligned with your capabilities," he acknowledged after brief reflection. "The Bennett firm has excellent reputation for innovation in wealth management approaches." His response was notably free from the subtle dismissiveness that had characterized his reactions to my professional developments in recent years. No implication that the opportunity was secondary to his own business pursuits, or that my considering it might impact my support for his projects. This shift represented meaningful implementation of the value recognition principles outlined in the Reconstruction Blueprint. It would represent significant professional evolution, I acknowledged, though I'm still gathering information before making any decisions. "I appreciate you sharing this," Harrison replied, his tone reflecting professional respect rather than personal entitlement. "It's exactly the kind of development our Reconstruction framework is designed to accommodate: individual growth opportunities within partnership context." This exchange, though seemingly routine, represented substantial evolution in our interaction patterns. Previously, career opportunities had been filtered through impact assessment on Harrison's business needs, with my professional advancement implicitly subordinated to partnership support functions. The new dynamic established individual growth as legitimate priority within relationship framework rather than potential conflict with it. Over subsequent days, I continued exploring both the Bennett opportunity and the Reconstruction possibilities with Harrison. The parallel processes created something I hadn't fully anticipated: genuine choice landscape based on positive options rather than defensive positioning. This psychological shift from protective necessity to preference-based decision-making transformed my engagement with both possibilities. The Bennett materials Marcus provided were impressively comprehensive, outlining division structure, client, acquisition strategy, and performance metrics with sophisticated integration of property management and financial optimization approaches. The opportunity represented genuine innovation rather than incremental advancement, creating new service models rather than implementing established frameworks. Simultaneously, Harrison continued demonstrating substantive implementation of the Reconstruction Blueprint principles, moving beyond conceptual agreement to behavioral manifestation. His communications about business developments included explicit acknowledgement of my strategic contributions to project structures. His engagement with the Bennett opportunity reflected genuine support rather than assessment of impact on his interests. Most significantly, his interaction with me consistently reflected partnership orientation rather than hierarchical positioning. A pivotal moment occurred during discussion of the commercial building housing Harrison's first development office, a property now owned by Oakmont Holdings. Rather than focusing exclusively on securing usage rights, Harrison proposed a collaborative redevelopment approach that would enhance the property's value while preserving its historical significance to his business journey. "The building represents an important milestone for redevelopment," he acknowledged, "but it's fundamentally an Oakmont asset with significant appreciation potential through strategic redevelopment. What if we approached it as a collaborative project, applying both our capabilities?" The proposal demonstrated authentic integration of our reconstruction principles, recognizing both emotional connection and financial reality, while creating mutual value through collaborative application of complementary capabilities. This wasn't negotiation positioning, but genuine partnership thinking, focusing on shared value creation rather than individual interest protection. As I considered both the Bennett opportunity and the reconstruction possibilities with Harrison, I realized that Oakmont Holdings had created something beyond property protection. It had established fundamental choice freedom that transformed my decision landscape. Whatever path I ultimately chose would represent authentic preference rather than constrained necessity. This realization crystallized during a conversation with Claire over lunch at a quiet restaurant near the financial district. After updating her on developments with both the Bennett opportunity and the reconstruction process with Harrison, I found myself expressing unexpected uncertainty. Both paths have legitimate value, I explained, which makes the decision more complex than I anticipated. The Bennett position represents professional recognition and growth opportunity, applying my strategic capabilities in innovative context. The reconstruction with Harrison, if successful, offers partnership transformation based on mutual value recognition rather than hierarchical positioning. Claire studied me with the particular attentiveness of long friendship. "What I'm hearing," she observed, "is that you're making this decision based on forward-looking value assessment rather than reactive positioning. That's significant evolution from where you were when establishing Oakmont as protective measure." Her observation illuminated something I hadn't fully articulated even to myself, that my decision framework had fundamentally shifted from protection to aspiration, from minimizing damage to maximizing growth. This transformation represented the true achievement of my strategic intervention, creating conditions where decisions could be based on authentic preference rather than vulnerable necessity. "You've established what I call the equilibrium advantage," Claire continued, drawing on her own experience navigating gender dynamics in financial leadership. When interaction occurs between parties with comparable power positioning, decisions reflect genuine preference rather than strategic accommodation. Most people never achieve that equilibrium, instead, making life choices from positions of relative advantage or disadvantage. Her framing precisely captured what I had created through Oakmont Holdings, not just property protection, but psychological equilibrium, the foundation for authentic choice rather than strategic positioning. This equilibrium transformed not just my external options, but my internal decision-making framework, liberating me from the accommodating patterns that had gradually diminished my presence in both professional and personal contexts. The question isn't whether to pursue professional advancement or relationship reconstruction, Claire suggested as our lunch concluded. The question is, what configuration of both creates optimal conditions for your continued growth and contribution? This reframing shifted my perspective from binary choice to integrated optimization, recognition that the equilibrium advantage created possibility for unique configuration rather than standardized selection from predetermined options. The pathway forward wasn't choosing between established alternatives, but designing integrated approach, optimized for my specific values and capabilities. Returning to my office, I began sketching preliminary framework for this integrated approach, not just choosing between Bennett partners and relationship reconstruction, but potentially creating unique configuration incorporating elements of both within sustainable structure. The equilibrium advantage didn't just provide legitimate choice between existing options, it created possibility for designing entirely new configurations based on authentic preference rather than external constraint. This realization represented the most profound transformation emerging from my strategic intervention, not just securing what I had built, but creating conditions where ongoing building could proceed from foundation of choice rather than accommodation. The equilibrium advantage transformed not just current decision landscape, but future possibility space, establishing psychological foundation for sustainable growth rather than merely correcting immediate imbalance. Whatever specific configuration ultimately emerged, the foundational achievement remained. I had transformed vulnerability into agency, constraint into choice, accommodation into authentic preference. The equilibrium advantage wasn't just about equal negotiating position in current circumstances, but about establishing sustainable conditions for ongoing growth and contribution without systematic diminishment. This was the true power of strategic foresight, not just protecting against anticipated threats, but creating conditions where threats themselves become transformed into growth catalysts, where defensive necessity evolves into preference-based opportunity. The properties secured through Oakmont Holdings represented not just financial assets, but psychological liberation, the foundational requirement for authentic living beyond protective positioning. The following week brought unexpected acceleration to both professional and personal developments. Marcus Bennett contacted me with news that their board had formally approved the Integrated Wealth Management Division, with implementation timeline moved forward by 3 months due to significant client interest. Meanwhile, Harrison had made substantial progress on operationalizing the reconstruction blueprint, developing specific implementation protocols for the partnership recalibration we had been discussing. These parallel advancements created pressing decision requirements, whether to pursue the Bennett opportunity, continue exploration of relationship reconstruction with Harrison, or attempt some integration of both pathways. While the timeline pressure was challenging, I recognized that it represented positive development, legitimate opportunities requiring active choice rather than reactive positioning. I scheduled a meeting with Sophia to discuss legal and structural considerations for various decision pathways. Her office in the downtown financial district provided appropriate setting for strategic discussion with privacy protection. The wall of windows behind her desk offered panoramic view of the city skyline, visible manifestation of the architectural development Harrison had contributed to over his career. "You've created enviable decision landscape," Sophia observed after I briefed her on both the Bennett opportunity and reconstruction progress with Harrison. Most clients in relationship dissolution situations face constrained choices between suboptimal alternatives. You've established multiple positive pathways with legitimate value potential. Her assessment confirmed my own analysis, but raised the fundamental question still requiring resolution. "The challenge now is determining optimal configuration," I acknowledged. "Each pathway offers specific advantages but potential integration complexity." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "Integration would require sophisticated structural design, particularly regarding potential conflicts of interest between Bennett Partners' client services and Harrison's development projects. However," she added with professional precision, "such conflicts can be managed through appropriate governance frameworks and disclosure protocols." Her response reflected exactly what I valued in Sophia's counsel: recognition of legitimate challenges without artificial limitation of possibility space. She identified constraints without allowing them to unnecessarily restrict option landscape. "I've been developing potential integration architecture," I explained, opening my tablet to display preliminary framework sketches. "A structure that would maintain appropriate boundaries while enabling value creation across domains." Sophia studied the diagrams with analytical attention, her expression revealing professional appreciation. "This is remarkably comprehensive," she acknowledged. "Most people approach such decisions from binary perspective, pursuing one pathway exclusively. Your integrated architecture creates possibility for simultaneous advancement along multiple value dimensions." Her validation reinforced my growing confidence in the integrated approach, not choosing between professional advancement and relationship reconstruction, but designing framework that could potentially accommodate both within appropriate structural boundaries. "The critical question," Sophia noted with characteristic directness, "is whether Harrison can genuinely adapt to this reconfigured relationship dynamic. Your design is structurally sound, but implementation requires psychological transformation that many individuals find challenging, particularly those accustomed to traditional success patterns. This observation identified the central uncertainty in my integrated architecture. Not the structural design, but the human adaptation capacity, particularly Harrison's ability to function within partnership framework that fundamentally differed from our historical patterns. While recent interactions demonstrated meaningful progress, sustainable transformation would require consistent implementation beyond initial accommodation. As I left Sophia's office, her final guidance remained particularly relevant. Whatever configuration you ultimately choose, maintain the equilibrium advantage you've established. The specific pathway matters less than preserving decision autonomy based on preference rather than necessity. This perspective reinforced my determination to approach the decision from strategic rather than reactive positioning, evaluating options based on future potential rather than past patterns, on growth opportunity rather than protective necessity. That evening, I met Harrison at a restaurant we both appreciated for its combination of exceptional cuisine and private dining spaces conducive to substantive conversation. The neutral territory provided appropriate setting for discussing potential integration of our individual pathways, his continuing development business, and my potential Bennett Partners opportunity within reconstructed relationship framework. "I've been thinking about your Bennett opportunity," Harrison began after we'd placed our orders, "and how it might integrate with our reconstruction framework rather than competing with it." His framing immediately demonstrated evolution from our historical interaction pattern, where my professional advancements had been implicitly evaluated based on impact to his priorities rather than mutual benefit potential. This shift reflected genuine implementation of our reconstruction principles rather than tactical positioning. "I've been considering similar integration possibilities," I acknowledged, appreciating his initiative in raising this perspective. "There are legitimate challenges, but also substantial opportunity for complementary advancement." Harrison nodded, removing a folded document from his jacket pocket. "I've sketched some preliminary thoughts on structural integration," he explained, unfolding what appeared to be architectural drawing adapted to relationship and business configuration. The document revealed sophisticated thinking about potential integration pathways, how my role at Bennett Partners could potentially create synergistic opportunities with Harrison's development projects while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries and disclosure protocols. The framework acknowledged potential conflicts while establishing governance mechanisms for managing them transparently. "This is thoughtfully constructed," I observed, genuinely impressed by the integration concept. "It addresses many of the structural considerations I've been examining." "The physical architecture of spaces influences human interaction patterns," Harrison explained, referencing his core professional expertise. "Similarly, relationship architecture establishes either constraints or possibilities for interaction, quality. I've approached this as design challenge rather than negotiation problem, creating structural framework that enables mutual growth rather than requiring compromise." This framing, design challenge versus negotiation problem, perfectly captured the evolution in Harrison's approach to our relationship situation. Rather than positioning for advantage within existing constraints, he was reimagining the structural framework itself to create new possibility space. This represented genuine application of his architectural thinking to relationship dynamics, potentially his most significant contribution to our reconstruction process. The framework acknowledges professional boundaries while identifying potential collaboration pathways, he continued, indicating specific elements of the design. For example, Bennett clients with development interests could potentially connect with Reed projects where appropriate while maintaining clear disclosure protocols and client privacy protection. The integration concept demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both business ethics and relationship dynamics, creating potential value flow while establishing appropriate boundaries against conflict exploitation. This wasn't simplistic win-win thinking, but nuanced architecture acknowledging Complex interaction between personal and professional domains. What's most important to me, Harrison added with uncharacteristic directness, is that this framework supports your advancement rather than constraining it. The reconstruction isn't about preserving our past configuration, but creating architecture that enables mutual growth in potentially transformed relationship. This statement represented perhaps the most significant evolution in Harrison's perspective, recognition that relationship value emerged from mutual advancement rather than complementary role division. The integration concept he'd developed didn't position my professional growth as subordinate to partnership maintenance, but as essential component of sustainable relationship architecture. As our discussion continued through dinner, exploring both practical implementation questions and philosophical foundations of the integration concept, I found myself genuinely engaged by the possibility space we were creating. This wasn't naive optimism about relationship restoration, but intellectual appreciation for sophisticated structural design that potentially enabled multiple value dimensions simultaneously. "There's something I should mention," Harrison said as we concluded our meal, his tone shifting toward greater seriousness. "I've formally ended any personal relationship with Monica Shaw. That development occurred before our reconstruction discussions began, though I should have communicated it explicitly earlier. The information wasn't surprising. Our recent interactions had suggested this direction, but his initiative in addressing it directly, rather than waiting for me to raise the question, represented meaningful implementation of the transparency principles in our reconstruction framework." "I appreciate your directness," I acknowledged, maintaining appropriate emotional boundaries while recognizing the significance of his communication. That clarity is helpful for our ongoing discussions. As we departed the restaurant, Harrison handed me printed copy of his integration concept. "Take time to review this thoroughly," he suggested. "It's presented not as final solution, but as architectural possibility for consideration alongside other pathways you're evaluating." His framing demonstrated genuine respect for my decision autonomy, positioning his concept as possibility for consideration rather than expectation for implementation. This approach reflected the equilibrium dynamic we had established, where interaction proceeded from mutual recognition rather than power imbalance. Returning home, I spent several hours reviewing Harrison's integration concept alongside my own framework sketches and the Bennett Partners opportunity materials. The comparative analysis revealed surprising alignment between Harrison's architectural approach and my strategic thinking, complementary perspectives potentially creating more sophisticated integration than either of us might have developed independently. This recognition carried significant implications beyond specific decision requirements. The reconstructed relationship Harrison had proposed wasn't merely correcting historical imbalances, but potentially creating genuine thought partnership, leveraging our complementary cognitive approaches. His architectural vision integrated with my strategic implementation capability. This possibility represented relationship value beyond emotional connection or practical convenience, intellectual partnership with unique value creation potential. Over subsequent days, I continued detailed analysis of integration possibilities, examining potential structures that might accommodate both professional advancement through Bennett Partners and relationship reconstruction with Harrison. The process wasn't merely analytical but values-based, clarifying which elements of each pathway aligned with my fundamental priorities and authentic preferences. A pivotal insight emerged during morning meditation session when mental clarity often crystallized after subconscious processing. The decision framework I'd been applying contained implicit assumption that professional advancement and relationship reconstruction represented competing priorities requiring allocation of limited resources. This framing reflected scarcity mindset rather than possibility orientation, focusing on constraint management rather than integrated optimization. What if, instead, these pathways represented complementary rather than competing value dimensions? What if the optimal configuration involved not choosing between them, but designing integrated architecture that enabled advancement along multiple dimensions simultaneously. This perspective shift transformed decision landscape from binary selection to architectural design, creating possibility space beyond predetermined alternatives. This realization didn't minimize legitimate implementation challenges or potential conflicts requiring management. Integration would necessitate sophisticated boundary maintenance and priority clarity beyond what most relationship structures accommodated. Yet the potential value creation from successful integration potentially exceeded what either pathway alone could provide: collaborative amplification rather than compromised allocation. The following day, I scheduled meetings with both Marcus Bennett and Harrison to discuss integration possibilities from their respective perspectives. These conversations weren't positioning toward predetermined outcome, but genuine exploration of architectural possibilities beyond conventional configurations. Marcus demonstrated characteristic perceptiveness when I presented potential integration framework with Harrison's reconstruction concept. Many professionals approach personal and professional domains as inherently conflicting, he observed. What you're proposing is sophisticated boundary architecture that enables value flow while maintaining appropriate separation. It's unconventional, but structurally viable with proper implementation protocols. His response reflected genuine consideration rather than reflexive dismissal, evaluating the integration concept based on structural integrity rather than conventional expectations. This approach, prioritizing functional capability over adherence to established patterns, exemplified what I valued in the Bennett Partners culture and reinforced my interest in the opportunity they presented. Harrison similarly demonstrated thoughtful engagement when I shared refined integration architecture, incorporating elements from both our frameworks. The boundary management protocols are particularly well conceived, he noted during our discussion. They establish appropriate separation while enabling potential collaboration where legitimate value exists. His response focused on substantive design elements rather than emotional implications, assessing integration architecture based on functional effectiveness rather than relationship preservation. This approach reflected genuine evolution in our interaction pattern, prioritizing structural integrity over accommodating positioning. The parallel conversations with Marcus and Harrison confirmed possibility space I had identified, that integration architecture could potentially enable advancement along both professional and relationship dimensions simultaneously, provided appropriate structural boundaries and implementation protocols. This wasn't naive optimism about effortless harmony, but strategic recognition of design potential beyond conventional configurations. As I continued refining potential integration architecture, incorporating insights from both conversations, the fundamental achievement became increasingly clear. Whatever specific configuration ultimately emerged, the transformation from reactive positioning to architectural design represented genuine reclamation of agency, from accommodation within existing constraints to active creation of new possibility. Space. This transformation hadn't occurred suddenly or through single decisive action. It had developed progressively through disciplined implementation of strategic foresight, from initial protective measures through equilibrium establishment to architectural design of preferred future. Each stage had created foundation for subsequent advancement, building progressive capacity for self-determined choice rather than externally constrained reaction. The Oakmont Holdings strategy that had initially secured my property interests had ultimately enabled much more significant achievement, the reclamation of decision autonomy based on authentic preference rather than protective necessity. This psychological transformation represented the true power of strategic foresight, not just protecting against anticipated threats, but creating conditions where genuine flourishing becomes possible beyond defensive positioning. Whatever specific pathway ultimately emerged, Bennett Partners advancement, relationship reconstruction with Harrison, or some integrated configuration incorporating elements of both, the foundational achievement remained. I had transformed vulnerability into Agency, constraint into choice, accommodation into authentic preference. This transformation represented not just strategic success, but fundamental reclamation of self-determination, the capacity to design preferred future rather than merely navigating imposed circumstances. 3 months after implementing the integrated architecture we had designed, I sat in my newly established office at Bennett Partners, reviewing quarterly performance metrics. The panoramic windows offered views of the city skyline, including several buildings Harrison had developed over his career. A fitting visual reminder of our reconfigured relationship that maintained distinct professional domains while establishing collaborative connection points. The division I now led, Integrated Wealth Solutions, had exceeded initial performance projections by 27%, with client acquisition rates surpassing even Marcus Bennett's optimistic estimates. Our approach integrating sophisticated financial structuring with strategic property portfolio management had proven particularly appealing to medical professionals and technology entrepreneurs, individuals with complex asset structures requiring holistic optimization rather than fragmented management. My assistant entered with the morning's priority correspondence, including the quarterly report from Oakmont Holdings. The Riverside commercial property closing completed yesterday, she informed me. All documentation has been processed according to the agreed framework. This transaction represented significant milestone in the implementation of our integrated architecture, the first major collaborative project between Oakmont Holdings and Reed Development under our reconfigured relationship structure. The Riverside property, originally part of Oakmont's portfolio, had been identified for potential redevelopment through Harrison's architectural vision while maintaining Oakmont's ownership position, creating value enhancement opportunity benefiting both entities through carefully structured collaboration agreement. I reviewed the transaction documentation with professional satisfaction, noting how precisely it followed the governance protocols we had established. Clear delineation of decision rights, transparent value attribution mechanisms, and explicit conflict management provisions, all implemented exactly as designed in our integration architecture. The structural integrity of our framework had proven robust in practical application, not merely theoretical design. My phone signaled an incoming message from Claire. Lunch at Westfield Terrace? Need your strategic brain for foundation board decision? I confirmed our meeting before turning to my laptop to review presentation materials for that afternoon's client consultation. The high net worth family had complex needs spanning multiple generations, exactly the situation our integrated approach was designed to address. I had personally developed their strategic framework, incorporating both sophisticated financial structuring and property portfolio optimization within comprehensive legacy planning architecture. As I made final refinements to the presentation, I reflected on how thoroughly my professional role had transformed. At Meridian, I had implemented established investment approaches within conventional frameworks. Now, at Bennett Partners, I created innovative structural designs tailored to complex client requirements, applying my strategic capabilities without constraint of predetermined methodologies. This evolution represented fundamental shift from execution within existing paradigms to creation of new possibility spaces, exactly the transformation I had sought when considering this opportunity. My phone rang with Harrison's name appearing on the display. "Good morning," I answered, maintaining the professional cordiality that characterized our reconfigured relationship. "Rebecca." His voice carried the particular focus I recognized from significant project developments. The Lakeside proposal received unanimous approval from the Planning Commission. We have preliminary clearance to proceed with the integrated residential concept. The Lakeside project represented another milestone in our new collaboration model, a development concept Harrison had designed with specific consideration for potential Oakmont investment, creating deliberately structured opportunity for mutual value creation while maintaining appropriate separation of primary business interests. "That's excellent progress," I acknowledged, genuinely appreciating the achievement while maintaining professional boundaries. Will you send the updated timeline for capital requirement sequencing? Already forwarded to your Oakmont address, Harrison confirmed. The phased implementation approach we discussed should align well with your portfolio diversification objectives. This exchange exemplified our reconfigured interaction pattern, focused on substantive value creation rather than emotional dynamics, maintaining clear professional boundaries while identifying legitimate collaboration opportunities. The relationship hadn't returned to its previous configuration, but evolved into something fundamentally different. A strategic alliance based on mutual respect and value recognition rather than traditional marital expectations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.